today we'll be talking about building APIs with Nest.js. And I already seen the comments, why don't we use Express? So we'll cover all of that and talk about it. So first of all, a brief introduction of who I am. Like Smith mentioned, a student at the University of Hong Kong. I have been developing for a few years now, and I'm absolutely in love with JavaScript, and I love to keep on exploring the different frameworks that are there to see how we can improve the way we do things and how things work. So we are going to be building APIs with Nest.js because we want to explore the complete potential of Node.js, and we want to see how it works with the typed framework. And Nest.js is a very strongly typed and structured framework. All right. So, but before we build any API, I think it's quite important to understand what is it that we might be building an API for, just so that we can follow along better. So let's say that for today's sake, we are building a platform for sustainable fashion clothing. So we want to see a couple of things that any e-commerce store would have. And as we would know by now that every platform more or less needs an API. And for an e-commerce store, it might look like buying products, having customers log in, adding more products by the store owner, and things like that. So that's something that we will be building an API for. Now, by now, it's quite clear the basic features are quite similar in more or less every API. Every API needs to create data, read it, update it, and then further on delete it. There are basically different permutations and combinations of these four operations that keep on happening with our data that help us to further work with it and make sure that they sufficiently supply to all the needs of our business, suppose. So you would be asking yourself, we get all of that, how to create an API, but then why are we even here talking about this? Why don't I just go ahead and use Express, right? And you're probably right about that, because let's see, like Express is super quick to set up, its complexity is really low, and you can learn it pretty quickly if you know basic JavaScript. And this platform in particular has no opinions of its own. You can do pretty much anything in any way with it, which could be great for several needs. But let's talk about scaling that API that you have. How scalable would your API be if you just simply use Express and you go about it? Probably not a lot. And certainly, even if you try to scale it, it's not going to be super simple, because it's possible that you made small mistakes in the beginning, which are making it now hard for you to scale your API. So, but is Nest.js now only for people who want to build scalable APIs? Yes and no, because let's say that you're just building an MVP, right? But like you don't know how far it can go. So I think it's always great to future proof however you do your development, and Nest.js is a great way to go about it. It's TypeScript based, it's highly opinionated, which in this case could be a good thing because it has certain ways in which it does things, which means that you don't have to think about the best practices because the creators have already thought about it. And the creator of Nest.js is a really smart person, and it's backed by a really good community. So you know that you're in good hands when you're following something that is done in the Nest.js way. It's very well structured, and the platform is highly extensible. Also, it uses and is supported and supports one of the most popular frameworks, and everything that's happening is JS. So it's like a very progressive framework, right? So now let's take a look at how a very basic project is started and how we would go about building it. Let's remember that what we're trying to build here is still somewhat, we're going to start like a basic e-commerce project. All right, we're going to sort of, for the purpose of this very small talk, we're going to skip things like authentication because they can become complicated when you're trying to just learn and understand how the framework works and what it does. So it's always good to start by looking at code and how things work. So let's look at how you would start a new project. Sorry if this text is like too little. So Nest, the very, very good thing about Nest is that it gives you great CLI tools, which makes your experience as a developer really good. So let's just, you can get started with installing the Nest CLI, and then you can do Nest new clothing store. And clothing store would basically be like the name of my project. And that's all you need to do. It asks you what package manager even you want to use, and I personally sort of prefer using Yarn for my projects. So I do that, and voila, there is my project, which mostly has all the basic things that any Nest.js project needs. All right, so now let's take a look at the directory and see what the main files would be. So there are obviously a lot of other files in the folder that I'm sort of skipping at this moment. And I want you to take a look particularly at the source folder, the SRC folder. And you must be feeling a tiny bit overwhelmed at this point because there is like a controller file, there's a module file, there's also a service, and then there's something called .spec.ts. Now, what is a .spec file? It's essentially a file where you can put all your tests. So controller.spec is where you can put your tests for the controller, and similarly, you could make these files for module and services as well. Okay, so now since this is the overwhelming, I think it makes more sense to first look at each of these different components that make up Nest.js, and then see later on how all of them come together to form a basic project. All right, so for this, we can see that there are three main building blocks in Nest.js. The first one being modules, then providers, and controllers. So I'll go through them one by one. With modules, they are basically there to give some sort of structure to your API, because in Nest.js, every application needs at least one module, which would be the root module. So it is the module that gets instantiated by default. And as you could see here, it's called app.module.js. And then what Nest does is it builds an application graph, so that you would start from the root module, and you would go further down to see which module is associated with which module, to then create a proper graph about it, a map of how different modules further interact with each other. So now let's first take a look into what a module file looks like. So as you can see here, this is what would come by default when you create a new module in Nest. All right, so you can see by just looking at this file that Nest.js is a very decorator-dependent framework. Everything gets defined and instantiated with the help of decorators. So in this particular case, if you want to say that this class is a module, you need to use the @module decorator. And then this decorator further goes ahead and takes in several parameters. In this case, there would be imports, controllers, providers, and then there are also exports. Now, again, these are a lot of words, a lot of terminology, but it will all come together pretty soon when you will understand what these things do individually. All right. So for now, we can remember that that Nest.js is a decorator-dependent framework, and that modules are basically how you can divide the different operations in your application, and they further are arranged in the form of a graph, which would say in our case look something like this. That you have the root app, which is your root module. This is where your application starts to create its graph. And then it goes ahead and it sees that, okay, we have three modules which root app further needs. They are user, product, and order. And then you can say that user further can divide its work into two separate modules, which would be admin and customer. What this structure really helps you to do is decouple your code very well and then reuse things as and when needed. It's possible that the order module needs to be accessed both by user and product, and they can both very well go ahead and do it. And all these modules, they perform independently, but they can all come together using the different dependency injections, which we will discuss very shortly. Okay, so, but then again, the root app does not really need to know about the admin or the customer module, because the root app is directly related to the user, and then the user takes care of the admin and the customer in this way. So they eventually form this graph structure, which is mostly unidirectional, but in very, very small cases, it could be bidirectional too. But unfortunately, that's not something we'll be discussing today. Okay, so now moving forward from modules, we have the next building block, which is a provider. Now, provider, I think the name sufficiently, explains what a provider is. It's something that provides, right? In our case, it could be providing logic, it could be providing data, it could be doing X number of things. Providers are basically classes that are injected as dependencies into other classes. They can be services, factories, repositories, other helper classes, and so on and so forth. Like, there is no limitation to what can be a provider. How you define a provider is by using this decorator that we see right here, which is called injectable. So when we say that there is a class and we put a decorator on top of it, which is at injectable, then what that means is that now this particular class can be injected into any other class. Now, again, like these injections and dependencies, it sounds complicated. So how does it work in Nest.js, right? Dependency injection works through inversion of control technique in Nest.js. So what it means is that it delegates the instantiation of dependencies to the IOC container, which in this particular case is the Nest.js runtime. So the whole thing works in 3 different steps. The first thing is you make an injectable, which could be your provider. So you declare that class. And then you go to your module and you say that this particular module needs a provider, which is this service. It could be any injectable which is needed as a provider by a module. And then when you compile the whole thing, Nest.js knows that, okay, these are the injectables that I have, and these modules need these injectables by putting them in the constructor parameter under providers. But then how do you start using these injections? So in this very code snippet, you can also see that inside the constructor, we have these 2 parameters called order repository and order item repository. And these are obviously now coming from our database, and we will get into type ORM a little later. But what this does is that it says that Nest.js needs to give order services these 2 particular dependencies, these very specific. So that is how it fills it up, and it gets you everything that your code needs. So instead of you trying to fill in data into your APIs, into your classes, Nest.js does it for you, which is why it's an inversion of control technique, wherein your classes don't have the control. They just say, I need this, and then the Nest.js runtime, which is your container, has all the control over how dependencies are getting injected. Okay, so now the third and very important building block of Nest.js is a controller. So what a controller does is, again, the name is very explanatory. It takes in requests from the server, and then it takes in the request, and then it processes on it, and then it gives a response back. So it controls how things are functioning, what a particular request is doing when it's being called upon. So let's see a very basic controller that gets created when you start your application. It's the same code. So again, you can see that a class can be created as a controller by giving it the decorator at controller. And then if you want to say that a request is a get request, you just put an at get decorator on it. And after that, whatever function you put in, those are the operations that will be performed to process that request. Now, inside the controller decorator, you can provide it an argument, which would be the path where it needs to go. And then again, in get, you can further define a string, which would tell us that, okay, this is the path where this needs to go further. So if in controller you had hi, and then in under get you had, say, 1. So what it would do is your URL would look something like your base URL /hi/1. So it's basically the controller work in such a way that you can sort of bunch together different requests under one controller. So the first string tells you that, okay, this is the base, and then under it you can further nest it. So that's the whole thing. So let's see what you would get if you sort of ran this request. You can see that you create your base URL, and then I did just slash because there are no other parameters to tell the name of the root. And when you run it, you get hello world, which is what your code here was doing. Um, Now we've gone through all the building blocks, we've seen how they work, what they do. Now let's look at the one main file that I sort of didn't touch upon back there. The main file is super simple. We don't play around with it a lot. It just contains a function which bootstraps your application. So it starts nest factory.create. This is how the Nest.js runtime is working. And it gives it the app module. It says that, okay, this is where we start from. And then this particular line that you see here, the const app is equals to await nestfactory.create. This is where the whole process of creating a map of all your modules start, and then the dependency injection begins, and this is how the whole application is bootstrapped. And app.listen sort of says that, okay, this is the port on which my app is going to run. So it's quite simple. We've got that out of the way. Okay. One of my favorite things about this whole thing, like I said, is the developer experience that you get. And as you can see in this video right here, you can generate a CRUD, like you can generate CRUD operations by this very simple line of code. It's called, okay, I'm going to run this again. You just do nest g resource users. Users is basically the name of your module. And then it creates more or less everything for you. The structure looks something like this. It creates entities, it creates a DTO, controller, module, service. So you don't have to go ahead and do all of this on your own, but the CLI sort of does it for you. Okay, so very quickly, I'm going to talk about what a DTO is. A DTO basically means it's a data transfer object. So in many cases, a DTO might look very similar to what an interface does, but it goes a bit ahead of interface. It can help you mask a few properties that you don't want to expose, or it can contain certain attributes which are needed by us, but they don't need to go in the database. For example, the password. Let's say that you're creating a user and you need the password to process, but then you don't want to store it in the database. So that's what can go in there. And you can also use class validators inside of the DTOs, which makes it super simple to do validation. Then you have entities, which is being just used as a class, like as an object for your database. And then you have the basic stuff. All right. Moving forward, let's look at the controller that's produced by this. You can see that here users is the base root that it found. And you can see that it already has the provider, which basically is a dependency that controller has. And here it's the user services. So a point to note here is that any dependency injection happens via the constructor. If you want to provide anything to your class, you send it through the constructor and you make sure that it's added in the providers of your module. So you put it as a provider in the module, and in the controller, you can just directly call it as a dependency in the constructor. Then you can see here we have a post request, and you can also see this very interesting @body decorator. It directly gives you access to the body of the request, and you have to not do anything like the rec.body or anything of that sort. And you can also say very easily over here that, okay, the body that comes here needs to have this structure, which in this case is the create user DTO that we talked about earlier. Okay, so similarly, we have a GET request. Now, this is a GET request with a path parameter. This means it can be user / any string, 1, 2, 3, 4, XYZ. And if it's a GET request, it's going to come at this particular route. Okay, now it's very important for any of this to make sense only with a database configuration, right? Because you want all your changes to persist. So you can do that via Postgres, and a very easy way to set up Postgres is through Docker. So here is a small snippet of a quick setup where you can set Postgres via a Docker script. I can share this with everybody later on, like not much time to get into the details of this. All right. Okay, so how this would work in Nest is that Nest actually gives you a type ORM package, which you can configure with your application. So this would mean that you already install this package called type or Nest.js /type ORM, and it gives you a type ORM module. and that you import into your particular module. So this is where the imports come in, when you don't just need to inject dependencies, but you want to say that, okay, these are the other modules that I need to use. So that is when imports works. So you can see here we have the product module, you have the users module, and then you also have the type ORM module at the root of it. You're saying for root, and then you're giving it a small configuration. You can set this configuration up as a JSON object and just give it that. I've created here a whole other class to do that thing. But again, that's not needed. And you can basically give it a very basic JSON object to go ahead with. Then let's look at the entities that we have here. So I have an order entity where, again, there's a decorator telling it that it's an entity. You have a prime. This is all of more of like type ORM stuff, which I'm trying to demonstrate that it can be very easily used in Nest.js as well. You can create a many-to-one relationship with the user entity. And then suppose you also have something called an order item, where you have a many-to-one relationship with the product and many-to-one with order. And this is just a small example of how it would look. Okay, so the next thing that we would now need to do is we have a database, we have connected to it, we have set up our entities. Now what we need to do is we need to make sure that we're also able to edit this database, right? So we will do all of our editing operations with the help of a service. So let's take a look at the order service here. Like I mentioned, through the constructor, we're going to inject all our dependencies. And the Nest.js package, this is what it's basically doing for us. It's giving us a decorator called inject repository, which lets us inject any repository of any entity kind. So here we are trying to inject a repository of a type order and of type order item. And both of these entities I've already shown you before. So we just create like these two repositories and we inject it into them. After that, everything is pretty smooth. You can just go ahead and make changes to this repository. Now, this function is doing a couple of stuff. It's basically creating a new order for us, which would require us to add an entry both to the order repository and to the order item repository. So a couple of operations happening here, but one we really need to focus on is the this.order_repository.save order. What it's saying is that, this is the new entry that we're going to add in the order. Similarly, we can do things like finding a new entry by just saying order repository.find_one. And we give it the ID name. You can also do things like delete by just saying .delete. Okay, so now it's time to see how all of this came together, how we made it work, and let's do a very small, quick Postman demo to see. Let's just see how the moving parts come together. So can we play the video in a bigger screen? All right. Okay, so here you can see that we're trying to run different requests. When we ran get on the users, there was no user. So we're trying to add a new user over here. So it's very simple. Like the way you create your controller is you just gave it a user's base, and then you can just create simple functions for like different requests. You can say add get for a get request and add post for a post request, or add patch for an update request. So we sort of fill in all these details that are needed. There is more associated code with it, but here we're just going to see how all of this works together when it's done. And you can see that it created a new user. And here in the result, you can see it gave it an ID by its own because that was auto-generated, right? Now, if we try to run the same thing again, we get an error message because we say that the user already exists. Moving forward, if we want to delete a user, we can again go ahead and delete the user. Now, if we try to send a request, we'll see that the new user we added does not exist here. Then there are a couple of things like you can see what products are there. You can then go and try to create a new product of your own. So you can give it all the details that it needs. Let's say it's like the name, and it might need things like how many things of a product you have, like what's the quantity, what's the description. And yes, that's how it would go. Let's just wait for this post entry to finish, and then we can discuss more about how this is working. All right. So yeah, once we send this request, again, it got an ID, which means we can see it's created in the database. We can do a GET request. And then if we try to get the orders, we would need two things with the orders that we saw, that the order needs a user, and the order item would need both a user and a product to associate itself with. So that is sort of how we will be giving it the details. So when you do an order request, though, at that time you need to provide the details both for the order and the order items, because like we saw in our previous slides, it's doing both of these operations in one particular function. So to go about it, we in the in one same body, we provided both the order. The order needs the user and the ID, and we can just copy a user that we have created. So we have to do all of this by ourselves right now because we don't really have a front end that's going to send data with it. So that is why we just manually copy data at this point. And the same would be done for order item, where it needs, again, it also needs a user and it needs the product. Also, it needs to see, like, what is the quantity that if I'm buying a product, how much of that product do I need to finally calculate the total. So you can see the product going in here, and then the quantity is XYZ. And then again, I wanted to add like multiple products to it, so I can then just go ahead and copy another product that we have in here. And we can see this is a product. Should have fast forwarded through this. I understand that in retrospect. But yeah, there we go. We have the quantity. And then so this is sort of all the data we're needing to send to this one request. And we press send, and we can see that, okay, it's giving us the total, and it's also added in the database because we can try to run a GET request on orders and see if it gives us the desired result. Okay, so here you've seen how we did a few basic operations on users, we did it on products, orders, and you already sort of know the basics by now to do anything of that sort. And it's quite simple to get started with doing all of that. Okay, so the next thing is that there are a lot of other interesting and amazing things happening in the Nest.js environment. You have things like guards, which means that if I have a request and I only want to say authenticated users to enter it or a certain authorized user to enter it, I can put a guard with a request. And putting guards is also pretty straightforward. You use decorators for the same, and you just say that, okay, this particular thing is guarded by this sort of authentication, suppose. Now, again, there are things like pipes, and there is also GraphQL support for Nest.js. So it means that if you like GraphQL and if you want to use it in your Nest.js API, you can totally configure that. If you want to use MongoDB, you can use MongoDB as well. So while it is very opinionated, it also provides a lot of support for you to do work in a particular fashion. And to anybody who's familiar with Angular, all of this is going to look very much like how things are done in Angular because it's heavily inspired from it. But the thing is that we see that and I mean, I understand a lot of people do not like Angular, but then don't carry that same prejudice over here to the server side, like to the backend development world. This way of doing things can actually be very helpful. And just because it's inspired from Angular does not mean that you can only use Angular as a front-end framework with it. Any framework works perfectly well, and there are like no restrictions. So yeah, that would be all about my introduction to Nest.js for you. I would be happy to take some questions from all of you, and like a huge thank you to really all of you for patiently listening through this whole long conversation about Nest.js.
Thank you, Manya. This was like amazing talk. And definitely for like developers who are like new to development, there are a lot of frameworks to start learning. And you actually did an amazing job explaining what Nest.js is. Obviously, we have the first question, is Nest.js better than Express?
It is a very valid question. Is it better than Express? Again, like I would like to go back to how I started. It's not necessarily about being better or worse. There are some great advantages that Express provides us, and similarly, the same goes for Nest.js as well. But in my opinion, if you're trying to build anything scalable, or even if you're starting something as a hobby project, but you really want it to grow later on, it's good to use Nest.js because it lets you use Express with it, or it lets you use Fastify with it, but it sort of also has a whole structure with it, which makes, if you follow that, it means that you are sort of building a more scalable API. So whether it's better or not sort of depends on where you see your project going. If you see your project growing and scaling, Nest.js is the way to go about it.
Awesome. We have a lot of questions coming up. Next is Nest.js completely in TypeScript?
Yes, Nest.js is a TypeScript framework, which means that everything has a type, which makes it simpler for you because you don't have to set up a framework or some sort of support to have a TypeScript based framework, because Nest.js is completely TypeScript.
Awesome. One more question coming up is, does Nest.js restrict us to use type ORM? Do we have to use an ORM?
Nest.js does not restrict us to use just a type ORM. It's something that, again, I prefer doing. I feel a structured SQL database can be really helpful, again, when you're trying to scale APIs. But you don't have to use an ORM. Like I said, it has great community support. There is a MongoDB package as well. So you can set up Mongoose with your Nest.js API and you're good to go.
Awesome. So you have already answered the next question.
Yes.
Yes, awesome. Thank you a lot, for joining us today. We hope to see
No
you
problem.
again.
It was amazing being here and talking to everybody. And if you have any more questions, you can find me on Twitter and shoot me questions there as well.